All right, so we're about to begin. So first of all, thank you guys for coming here tonight and being a part of this special African Forum, where this is part one, and then part two takes place on the 28th, I believe, with actually the 21st. With we're sort of going to be looking at the whole South African thing, a generation after apartheid. So with art, music, and that type of thing. So Mr. Coco Fele will be the MC for that evening on the 21st. So I hope you will join us again for that. So for tonight, we're here to remember two very special people in our community. First, we're going to begin with the legendary Robert Nesta Marley, remembering Bob with Mr. Clive Walker here, who is a scholar on Marley and the Wailers. So I'd like you to put your hands together and welcome him. This is Mr. Clive Walker. And then we will get into remembering Mr. Al Hamilton, because I'm sure you guys are very familiar with the work that Al has done here in Toronto. And so here we go. So put your hands together, please, and welcome Mr. Clive Walker. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I know this is the Al Hamilton room at the moment, but I think we can take a few minutes just to remember Bob Marley, whose birthday was yesterday. I think he would have been something like 75 now, I think. Maybe 77. Yeah, so they would have been. Yeah, I think. I'm sure most of you know Bob Marley's song "Natural Mystic," which is the opening track on what has been described by Time magazine as the album of the century. So it was the Exodus album, and there's a conceit in on that track that I think was devised by Chris Blackwell, and the conceit is that the opening bars of the song are essentially rolling very quietly. And so, you know, if you, those of us from the time of vinyl will know that once you put the needle on the record and it doesn't sound loud enough, that you would turn up the volume. And then what happens is, when it gets to the proper level, it explodes. And I think in many ways that's a metaphor for Marley's, the trajectory of Marley's iconography. He started off as an artist, really a ska artist. I was going to say reggae artist, but he started off as a ska artist who was known, a gifted artist who was known in the Caribbean and in his diaspora during the 60s. By the 70s, he became an international superstar, and by the you know, and then actually after he died, he became an icon, right? A ubiquitous figure in popular music generally. And so, you know, but I think along with that comes a number of problems, I think, because, you know, the issue comes up now as to why we should be remembering Bob. Like, why is he an icon? You know, has it got to do with how many children he fathered? Has it got to do with, you know, how many women he, you know, partnered with? You know, does it have to do with his weed smoking or his long dreadlocks? I think sometimes some of these things get, you know, we confuse some of these things with why it is that we you know, we see him as a great artist. And I think there's a biography that was written by Timothy White, an American journalist named Timothy White, and throughout this book, it's called Catch a Fire, the life of Bob Marley. Some of you may know it. And in this book, right in the premise, in the preface, Timothy establishes this idea about Bob, that Bob was a Mile man, right, or an Obia man. And for those of you who are not Jamaican, a Mile man or Obia man could be described as a shaman, or sort of, you know, in some ways a demigod. And in some ways, that biography kind of was a template for kind of establishing this idea of Bob as a prophet, and Baba's, all this stuff. And sometimes when we elevate our heroes like that and make them seem otherworldly, right, sometimes they get away from us, right? In much the same way as, you know, maybe some people would see this idea of, say, the mythic idea of, say, somebody like Elvis Presley. And, but for those of us who I mean, I was, you know, used to see Bob Marley walking on the road. I remember seeing Bob on JVC television, you know, having smoked weed before he performed, you know, basically collapse on stage. So for me, he wasn't really this demigod and this shaman type figure. For me, he was a very gifted musician, highly gifted musician. He was somebody who was an excellent band leader, and he was somebody who was really an activist, right? Who uses his music for activism and for equal rights and justice. And so, if we're going to see Bob now as an artist, right? Then still, I think we have to drill a little bit deeper now to understand which part of his artistry that we're really appreciating. So we know that Bob was a singer, we know that he was a musician, and we know that he was a songwriter. So let's start with the musician, sorry, with the singer part. Let's start with the singer part first. Now, one of the things that a lot of Jamaicans will ask other Jamaicans, or maybe ask people outside the culture, as a trick question is, well, who do you think is the best singer in roots reggae? Or who do you think is the best singer in rocksteady? And the trick to that question is that, you know, the answer isn't Bob. Because we know in Jamaica that some of the greater singers, and I'll give you the context for this, because the Jamaican context is that in Jamaica we see somebody who's really singing from an R&B soul kind of template. That kind of smooth style is what we're looking at as somebody who is really a great singer. So we're looking at people like Dennis Brown, we're looking at people like Delroy Wilson, we're looking at Ken Booth, we're looking at Leroy Sibbles, who used to live here in Toronto. Those are the kind of voices that we elevate, right? And these were all contemporaries of Bob. So if we're going to talk about Bob as a great singer, right, I'm not sure that he would make, you know, the top 10. He might not even make the top 10, right? So let's leave that, the singer part aside. So let's talk about him as being a musician. Now, Bob Marley played guitar, played acoustic guitar, rhythm guitar on stage, acoustic guitar in the studio to accompany himself singing Redemption song. It was a lovely guitar that he played. But if we're going to see Bob as a really outstanding and great musician in the Jamaican context, then it's going to be difficult. It's going to be very difficult. Because now you have to compare him to Ernest Randall. You have to compare him to Don Drummond, to Tommy McCook. These are great jazz musicians who funnel their jazz through a particular type of scale, right? And if we leave that era and go to the roots reggae era, then there's just two names I have to mention, Sly Dunbar and Robbie Shakespeare, who can do funk, they can do jazz, they can do reggae, they can do anything, right? But, you know, let me make it a little bit fairer and say, let's compare it to some people now who are singers and musicians. So let's take Cat Core from Third World, for example. Now, Cat Core sings lead sometimes with Third World and does harmony, but he's primarily a lead guitarist, and an exceptional lead guitarist who's underrated. Because at this stage in the written history of reggae, we talk mostly about singers, and we talk mostly about, we haven't really gotten to the stage where we're writing books about musicians yet, right? But Cat Core would have to be one of the great guitarists. We talk about Ernest, but we need to talk about other guitarists. And Cat Core can do blues, he can do classical, he can do jazz, you know, Cat can do rock, a lot of rock. Solos are in his Third World music. So I'm not sure Bob could compare to him. And then we can take Leroy, right? Let's talk about Leroy for a second, right? Leroy used to live in Canada. Leroy, who was the lead singer of the classic group, the Heptones, right? Was an excellent bass guitarist. Not just an excellent bass guitarist that maybe played some bass guitar on some of his own songs. He was actually the house one of the house musicians of Studio One, which was like the Motown of Jamaica, right? And played on classic songs, played bass on classic reggae anthems like the Abyssinian Sata Masagana and Burning Spear's Door Peep. So now, I mean, it's difficult for Bob in this company. Very, very difficult for him. But where he really is outstanding, where he really has an overarching presence, not just in reggae, but in popular music generally, where, you know, people like Bob Dylan and Curtis Mayfield can be mentioned in the same sentence as him, it's songwriting. Songwriting is the place where Bob really excels. And to demonstrate this, right, before Bob signs with Island Records and starts his career as an international recording artist, before that, he actually has already established an international career as a songwriter. So, an African-American pop singer named Johnny Nash comes to Jamaica in the late 1960s and hears Stir It Up on the radio in 1969 and is in love with it. And I think it's Neville Willoughby and Dermot Hussey and these people who take Johnny Nash to meet him and so on. And eventually Johnny takes him to England. They travel to England and so on. And the promise, I think, is that he will, you know, do something for the Wheelers. But really, what Johnny is interested in is Bob's songwriting. And so there's an album that comes out called I Can See Clearly Now, a 1972 album, in which Bob has 3 songs, Comma Comma, Guava Jelly, and Stir It Up. And this album is a monster hit on both sides of the Atlantic. So, and that album really cements Bob as a songwriter, as an international songwriter. From there now, in the following year, Barbra Streisand, the queen of adult contemporary music, possibly hears Johnny Nash's version of Guava Jelly, and she records that on her album, right? When Catch a Fire comes out, in December of 1972, the great African-American bluesman Taj Mahal then re-records Slave Driver, right? So this is all in the early 70s, before, because, you know, Bob doesn't really break through until like 1976, 1977. So this is all in 1972, 1973 that this is happening. So he's already established as a songwriter. By the time the Burning album comes out in 1974, you know, I don't know, maybe something like 6 months later, the rock guitar god, Eric Clapton, hears I Shot the Sheriff. And his career is kind of sagging a little bit. And he puts it on his Ocean Boulevard album, and it blows up, right? So his version of I Shot the Sheriff is #1 on both sides of the Atlantic. And it is so, I mean, the thing is so twisted that some people think that it's Eric's song. I think Spike Lee was actually in Toronto saying something that, you know, telling a story that he thought it was Clapton's song. And what is this island boy doing, singing? But, you know, I'm trying to demonstrate here this idea that, I mean, all of these great musicians, most of them iconic, had already recorded Bob's songs very early in his own recording career. And so I think, I mean, and aside from him just being, you know, just that incredible quality, poetic songwriter, it's the messages also, right? He's got these messages of equality, messages of justice, messages of redemption. He's saying things about women in these songs. You know, the song where he talks about the youth that, you know, gets shot down in the street and dies. You know, the subject of that song is the woman, right? There's of course No Woman to Cry, you know, and so on. So there's a number of themes that you can hear in Bob's music. And it's not just about, you know, being revolutionary, which is, of course, very important and very significant. But Bob, you know, covers all corners. He can write songs about romance. He can write songs about sex. He can write songs about spirituality. You know, these are all the themes, really, of reggae, of roots reggae, right? So that it's kind of like an organic whole. And so I think we have to look at that balance in Bob's songwriting, and we also have to look at that balance in how we remember him. That it can't be just about, well, how many women did he impregnate, how many children did he have, how much weed he smoke, and all those things. I don't think we want to kind of have a sense of why he's an icon. And in my opinion, I think, you know, one of the key reasons that he's an icon is certainly him as a songwriter. Thank you very much.
Any questions to Mr. Walker before we move on?
Yeah, I have one.
Yes, sir.
One of the things that I think he hasn't got credit for, I mean, and his influence on the whole Rastafari movement itself. Can you talk about that? Because I think, in a sense, it gave it some legitimacy, his association with it. Or...
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think, you know, the reason why Rasta is spread throughout the world now, really. I mean, I think there's more Rastas in South Africa and in a number of other countries than there are in, I think there's a film right now that's being shown at the ROM by his granddaughter, Danisha Prendergast. And I haven't seen the film, but I saw an excerpt of it where she was saying that in Israel, I mean, there's more roots reggae being played in Israel than there is in Jamaica. So, I mean, that's definitely Bob. That's Bob. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, I think, you know, we also have to be a little bit careful because there, you know, there's other reggae artists involved here, and I don't want to fall into that, you know, that trap of saying that it was entirely Bob. But he's certainly responsible for a lot of it, right? You know, in terms of his impact and his charisma. But certainly during the post-Bob Marley period, you know, you had the traveling reggae sunsplash. The original reggae sunsplash package traveled the four corners of the world. And we can't forget Peter. I mean, you know, Otis wouldn't forgive me if I forgot Peter. I mean, Peter really was quite big as well. And I think one of the things I say to people that I think is sometimes might be surprising to them is that when Bob was alive, he was never on national television in America, right? I think he was on Gil Noble. I mean, you know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Otis. But Peter was on national television. He was on Saturday Night Live, you know, and performing with Mick Jagger. And so, you know, I say that just to say that Peter had quite influence, you know, as well. So, but yeah, I mean, to answer your question in a nutshell, Bob had a lot to do with the spread of Rasta internationally.
Justice.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you know, I know before, while Bob Marley was alive, we were talking about Peter Tosh, and I know that they worked together a lot, but apparently there was some bad vibes when Bob had left the island, and you know, it was sort of reported that Peter Tosh had him up as selling out the culture. So I'm wondering if by the time Bob had passed on, if they had reconciled those differences, or if he sort of died with Peter Tosh still having those bad feelings.
Yeah, I mean that's a question that is you know, that has kind of been buzzing around, and I don't think it's a question that has been handled, certainly not in the writing and in the scholarship. But I think the best way to look at that is the three of them were, you know, Bonnie, Peter, and Bob were brothers, right? In every sense. So in the positive sense, right, and in the negative sense. I mean, in any family there's jealousy, right? In any family there's one-upmanship, right? And I think those things existed. I think part of the problem is that, especially in today's culture, we see it in today's culture with all the tabloids and all that stuff, right? These things get played up to the point where if they play out in public, sometimes it can exacerbate them even more. And I think there's part of that brotherly friction, right, You know, I'm one of those people who think that, I mean, there's some Jamaicans, some of them older than myself, who think that, well, you know, the Wailers, you know, were best together. I personally think that it was time for them to break. It was a super group, really, very similar to the Beatles, and I think it was good for them to break up. Because if they didn't break up, we wouldn't have gotten Natty Dread, we wouldn't have gotten Legalize It, we wouldn't have gotten Black Art Man, if you look at it that way, right? And I think, but I think there were some issues there, but I would describe them as brotherly issues. And these issues existed even during the 70s, right? I think there's a story that Otis told me about a concert, I think it was 1978 concert, I think it was in LA, where Peter jumped up on stage and sang Get Up, Stand Up with him, right? Now Get Up, Stand Up is Peter's song, even though they credit both people with it. It's really, I mean, you listen to the song lyrics, it's sound, I'm saying this, you know, to say that, you know, maybe Bob maybe added a word or a sentence, but when you listen to the song and look how the lyrics were really organized, it really matches in with the other stuff that Peter did, right? And Peter jumped up on stage with him and they sang together, right? And this is during the time when they should have been arguing. So that's why I describe it as a kind of a brother thing, you know what I mean? So, you know, I don't want to go deeper into it than that. That's how I would want to pull it off. And you can look at, you know, I don't know, you know, we could talk all night about that stuff. You know, the Temptations, the Impressions, right? What happened to all of these groups? The Supremes, I mean, they made plays about this stuff. You know, Diana Ross being pushed to the front, and the other women, you know. So it really is not even different from any of these other super groups, right? That had super talents in them, and they ended up going off and kind of have, you know, Peter said basically, there's an interview actually, I think he did it on City, where he said, look, I was tired of decorating Bob's music. Peter says, I was tired of decorating Bob's music. I wanted to go out there and do my own music because I had stuff I wanted to say. And the truth is that when the Wailers were, I mean, people have decided that the Wailers was a democratic thing. It wasn't democratic. Bob was the lead singer. He sang the majority of the songs. It's the truth, right? Even when they were with Lee Perry, right? When they went to Chris Blackwell, it's when Peter got maybe 2 or 3 songs on Catch a Fire, and Bonnie got 2 or 3 songs on Burning. But when they were with Lee Perry actually favored Bob, right? So, and actually Rita talks about that really is Bob that Lee Perry was in, you know. So, you know, I think some of this really has to be, actually I should write about it, but, you know, some of this really should be dealt with properly.
Another question?
I wanted to, since we're really going there, to talk about the connection between Joseph Hill and Bob and whoever might have been in that connection back before culture. Can you talk about Bob and Joseph?
In terms of Joseph Hill and Bob.
I mean, I understood that they were.
Was it Peter?
I understood that they were mates before Bob was singing covers, before any of that happened. I understood that Joseph Hill of Culture was connected with Bob. And there's times when I listen to Joseph and I wonder, is it Bob? Is it Peter? Is it like, what was the influence for Culture? What?
Right.
I always thought there was some, you know, I was hearing other inflections, but I didn't want to ascribe it to Bob, although I know at one time we were very close. So I was just wondering if you had anything to kind of...
Right, I mean, I think, you know, in terms of the whole vocal thing, I think, and that's something, there's an essay that I've written, which I based this talk on, it was published, you know, in 2010, and one of the things I talked about in that was how Bob's voice changed, right? Bob's voice changed from a kind of a higher, kind of more smooth sounding R&B voice in the ska period, to in the reggae period now, his voice sounds a lot more hollowed out, a lot more rough, right? And, you know, he's admiring, you know, singers like Burning Spear and these singers, right? And the singers with the more rough edge voice. Part of the thing that I try to kind of insinuate in the piece is that, you know, there was some competition between Bonnie Wailer and Bob, and even Junior Brathwaite, who was one of the original ska Wailers, right? there was this whole thing that Junior Brathwaite had a better voice than Bob, and that Bonnie, you know, had a better voice than Bob, more in the R&B sweet vein.
Yeah.
And, you know, who knows? Maybe Bob heard this stuff and decided, well, you know, I'm gonna actually try to go in a different route and try to be more organic with my voice and try to be more indigenous and maybe less Americanized in that way. Exactly. So that's one way of kind of looking at that, because Bob definitely wanted that kind of ragged. I think he actually described that ragged thing. But I think Joseph Hill, though, is some people fairly or unfairly kind of talk about Joseph Hill as being kind of like Burning Spirit Jr., right? Which, you know, maybe that might be a bit too excessive, because Joseph Hill had a fantastic voice. But I think people kind of see him as, because Burning Spirit came first, obviously, right? And I think that, you know, Joseph Hill kind of comes out of that kind of vocal tradition, which is more of a Jamaican indigenous vocal tradition compared to the more R&B sounding stuff that would be like Leroy and Delroy and Dennis Brown and those people.
One more question, anyone? Clifton.
I'm good, Clifton.
There's a fine line between, say, tribute and the brand of Marley and pimpification, right? Do you see more pimpification of Marley by the Marley estate along the lines of, say, Bob Marley, rings, boots, shoes, headphones?
Yeah, I mean that's really, I mean, I think, yeah, I think you know, personally I find that problematic. I mean, I think, you know, there's a whole thing in Jamaica now. You know, everything is brand this and brand that. You know, I think one of the things, I mean, to step back and kind of look at it, you know, from the larger picture, Clifton, I think, you know, because we're, you know, in a third world situation, we tend to look at things more in terms of money. So, for example, if you whenever they write about culture in Jamaica or the arts, especially in the newspapers, the journalism there tends to reduce everything down to money, how much money you can make, right? And so you get fake journalists who are really business people, I won't mention their names, who write all these articles in an Observer. They're managers, actually, and they're you know, marketers who actually get space, you know, actual, you know, this is not ads, but they get space to talk about how the industry should be moved to make money, and this is how we should make money. There's very few people writing about art as art. So, okay, here's a film, what is artistic about it? Here's a song, what's artistic about it? It's usually about how it makes money. And so that attitude now kind of fuels what you're talking about. So, you know, if we're having this discussion in Jamaica, people might not have the same answer or the same attitude that we would have. Because in the context of a North American kind of metropolitan point of view, we're you know, sort of more looking at the art aspect, whereas there it's kind of reduced to money. I don't know if that makes sense.
I don't know if it's much different here. Seems to be.
I guess the catch-22 is, I think, is it the Marley estate that actually is doing the branding, or is it being branded?
Well, no, well, I was broadening it because there's this thing called Brand Jamaica, right? Where, you know,
But it's song.
how you know, like everything you try brand now, like you try brand bold, you know, and some of it comes legitimately from the fact that, you know, let's, you know, some, like I said, a company like Roots, for example, you know, they use ice green and gold, and they use a lot of Jamaican, you know, imagery in their products and so. And so the Jamaican government get caught running behind. I'm just using Roots as an example. You know, running behind it, right? And so, yeah, exactly. So that's part of it. So they say, well, boy, we put a brand is quick before somebody else does it, right? And that's kind of the attitude. So everything is brand this, brand that. I mean, you almost get the sense that, you know, everybody is working for a huge marketing department, right? But what I was trying to show is the social reason for why that comes about. I mean, a lot of it has to do with, well, you know, we can't have all these people are foreign. We can't have the diaspora or just the general people in America and England running away with our stuff. So there is that reason for it, right? And the Marleys kind of have an extreme kind of hold on that, because you can't do anything without their permission, which is right. And you know, to some degree, there's some legitimacy to that too, right? You know, so even though some of us would like to write a screenplay or write a play, you know, somebody from here did an album of covers. I think this dentist guy did this and wanted to get a photograph of Bob, and they wouldn't give him the rights to it, which is, that's an extreme, is what I'm saying. But sorry.
How effective is the One Love brand for Jamaica? Because I see it all the time, I hear it all the time on TV. This is the Jamaican government or the tourist board or somebody who's taking hold of that, and it's used to promote Jamaica. Could you tell on it?
Well, I mean, clearly, the Marley family has given them the rights to use that, right? And, I think the question that is typically asked is, how would Bob see that, right? Because when he was alive, right, I mean, the government didn't want to know anything about him, right? Yeah. And so, there's a dichotomy, it's the same dichotomy that Clifton's talking about. So on the one hand, and I mean, the song itself, One Love, has kind of been turned into something, has been turned on its head. Because the original ska version of that song was really about fighting against tribalism and gang warfare in certain areas of what is now concrete jungle, right? So when he said one love, one heart, he was talking about unity of warring gangs, right? When he sang the song over on Exodus, right, clearly it was more about humanity. It was like a nice pop song about humanity. But, I'm not so sure that, I mean, well, we can think about what he would have thought to know that the government and the tourist board is using that now. And it's really been kind of gutted. The message behind that song has kind of been gutted out, in my view anyway, right? But, I mean, some people say that he would have been okay with it, I mean, some people say the opposite. So, I mean, but your guess is as good as mine, how it would have been seen. But I think the meaning of it has really been, that's something to really think about.
Right. So Bob was 36,
yes,
right,
yes.
when he passed away. And so he's left quite a bit of a legacy of music and children. So if we should ask you this in terms of your own sort of exploration and research, what would you say, just to summarize your presentation, is this importance from an African perspective and from a global perspective? How would you sort of put that stuff together?
Well, I think he's one of the, I think, as an artist and as a musician, he really is a kind of one of the most important products of the diaspora, the African diaspora, right? Certainly of his generation, right? That's how I would describe him in terms of, and his promotion of the idea of African unity, the idea of unity in the diaspora, his connection between the diaspora and the continent, the fact that he himself traveled there, right, and made that connection personal, not just to Ethiopia, but to other countries in Africa, performed there, and really made a huge impact on that continent. You know what I mean? I know that there's some, theorists and scholars who have kind of tried to say that he's mixed race and he's part white and this is part of why but all I have to do is look at his lyrics. All I have to do is look at his lyrics. I mean, he was a Rastafari, right? Who was dealing with Africa as a center, right? And despite even some of the comments that he made that might seem ambiguous, the lyrics don't lie, right? The lyrics are there.
Yeah. So if I could ask you, can you sort of compare any other musician or artist that has this sort of global impact from your perspective? That
well, I mean, I know that some people. I mean, there's some so-called Marley experts that want to kind of again put Marley into some kind of different orbit. I'm not one of those people because I'm kind of I listen to all kinds of music. I'm not just a one music person, right? And I learned from people like Otis, right? So I listen to all kinds of music. So I think Fela was great, I think Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, you know, these people were all great, right? I think Marley is among that, you know, is in that orbit, is in that section. But I know some people would want to say, well, oh, it's just Bob alone, or it's just Duke alone. Yeah, you know, I mean, there's great artists out of Brazil, Gilberto Gil, you know. So, you know, it's you know, that's how I kind of see that, right? I mean, I think it's nice for things like, you know, Exodus being the album of the century. I have no problem with that. What I'm saying is, if we're looking at the broad sweep now, there's a lot of great artists of African heritage that we have to adore in you know, the same way and talk about them in the same sentence. Right. You know, Curtis, Marvin Gaye.
Yeah, perhaps fair enough to say that he's actually opened the doors for inviting a lot of African music in terms of ska, R&B, and all of it, right? Yeah, I mean, it's a family of music, you know. I think that's how we have to look at it. I mean, you know, reggae has, you know, kind of grew out of, in some ways, or was influenced by R&B and jazz, right? But we have been, in turn, influenced, you know, African-American artists and African artists and artists in Brazil and everywhere, right? So, you know, it's a conversation, right? It's a diasporic and African conversation. That's the way I would, you know, look at it. All right, thank you very much. That was wonderful. Yes, we're going to just once again. I'm just going to make a